Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about Notre Dame under Marcus Freeman, how a lot of things are happening up there that haven't necessarily happened over the last couple of years, and it feels like they're hitting just another gear up there in South Bend, and that's a pretty scary thing for all of college football, that's for sure. But let's start to break down this playoff and talk about the SEC and the Big Ten. Obviously, when this playoff agreement was signed, it was the SEC and the Big Ten kind of running the show. They were the ones kind of making the decisions as this unfolded, and they were the ones that got the biggest piece of the pie, whether it comes to revenue or the number of teams they're likely to get in or everything in between. The SEC and the Big Ten came out of this feeling very good about the way that they were going to go into this new playoff, but the question becomes, what happens if they don't necessarily get what they want this upcoming year? What happens if they don't dominate the playoff the way that they're expecting and get 7, 8, maybe even 9 teams into this field and absolutely dominate what they want to dominate, which is the postseason in college football? And there's tons of things that can obviously happen with this. When you talk about college football in pretty much every conference, there's a couple of different paths that they can take. There's a couple of different ways that conferences can shake out, whether it's, cannibalism and everyone kind of eats each other up and it doesn't necessarily get very far. No one has that elite record at the end of the year, or you have some teams just leave everyone in the dust and have a couple of teams that are at the very top, 11-1, 12-1, what have you, and then you have a couple of teams that are 8-4, 9-3, sitting a little bit on that kind of bubble for the 12-team playoff. So it'll be fascinating to kind of watch this unfold, but I think there's going to be so many things that kind of happen around this over the season, and obviously the SEC and the Big Ten are going to be a huge topic of conversation. They are the ones that they're the best conferences, just plain and simple. They are the two best conferences in the country, and they're definitely going to be the best teams in the country in those conferences. I would make a really good argument that probably about 8 of the top 12 teams in pretty much any year are going to be from these conferences. The question is, does that kind of match who gets into the playoff? Because this is going to be a battle across the 12-team playoff where you have to compare these conferences with the, lower level conferences, if you will, the ACC and the Big 12. You're going to have to figure out how they kind of match up with each other and how that all works. And it's going to be fascinating to watch. But obviously, as we talked about, there's 2 paths for every conference, and the SEC and the Big Ten could follow either of them, really. Texas and Georgia are the teams that everyone's pointing to in the SEC. They lead in the odds to win the SEC and win total in the SEC, so they're the teams that absolutely everyone is watching, and they absolutely could be the teams that pull away from everyone. They could be 11-1 at the end of the year, and one be 11-2, one be 12-1 after the SEC championship, and everyone else is like 9-3, 8-4, kind of in that pack that it's going to be a little bit confusing for them. You could also have, Ole Miss or Bama be in this group. Absolutely could leave everyone in the dust, whether it's with UGA or with Texas or with each other, Bama and Ole Miss at the top of the conference. So it'll be fascinating to watch that unfold. Those are obviously the teams that everyone's kind of watching as we get into the SEC. And then in the Big Ten, it's Ohio State and Oregon. These are the teams that everyone's pointing to, and the same exact thing could happen, whether it's Ohio State and Oregon absolutely pulling away from everyone, going 12-1, 11-2, or maybe Michigan joins that group, maybe Penn State joins that group, but those 4 teams kind of stand above everyone else just a little bit, and definitely will be the teams that, if this was going to happen, if there were going to be 2 teams that kind of pull away from the pack, those are likely going to be where they come from, those 4 teams. So it'll be fascinating to kind of watch that unfold. But also, you have a couple other teams that are sitting kind of right on the outside, and what they do probably has more of a inkling of what's going to happen in the playoff, whether it's Tennessee. Obviously, they have a huge amount of expectations for this year. Missouri, OU, all of these teams are definitely looking at this year in the SEC as years that they can take what they want. They can get into the conversation to get to Atlanta. They can get into the playoff. They can do some of the things that Tennessee, Missouri, and not so much OU by any means, but Tennessee and Missouri especially have struggled to do, which is get into the playoff. Oklahoma in the SEC, it's going to be a new type of battle, so it'll be fascinating to watch those teams unfold, but they're going to have a ton to say about how this all shakes out, and they could be 8-4 at the end of the season, they could be 10-2 or 11-1, and it'll pretty much decide the way this playoff breaks down. Also in the SEC, you have LSU and Ole Miss. LSU, more importantly, kind of sitting right on that bubble line. Whether you're the 5th or 6th or 7th best team in the conference, you're one of those teams that absolutely will have something to say about the SEC as a whole and the playoff overall, but it'll be fascinating to watch that. And then the Big Ten, you obviously have, Michigan and Ohio State are going to be two of the teams that everyone is watching this year. And then you obviously have the Iowas, the Wisconsins, the teams that absolutely can make some noise if they're going to, have a couple of things break their way throughout the season. Nebraska and USC are two other teams that I'm definitely watching for that, but they could be at 8-4 as well. They could be at 7-5, or they could be at 9-3 and 10-2. So it'll really decide the way that this is going to go in the playoff, because there's been this sentiment around the expanded playoff and the 12 team that we won't really have too many arguments anymore. There won't be this huge battle between the two entities of who's more deserving, who's the better team, all of these battles that happened in the 14 playoff. I think they're going to be more confusing, if I'm being totally honest. I think there's going to be more teams at the 10-2, 9-3, 8-4 region, and on top of that, you're going to have to compare them to other conferences. It's no longer, being able to compare them to a couple of teams. You now probably have to compare pretty much every team across the country to 4 or 5 different teams, unless they obviously get the auto bid. That's a little bit different. But in the ACC, you could have Florida State and Clemson that make a ton of noise. You could have Virginia Tech and Miami that absolutely make noise. But all of those teams could go 9-3. All of those teams could find their way to Charlotte as 10-2 teams or 9-3 teams. And then you're having a conversation of, even if the person gets to a conference title, do they deserve to be in? Or the other way around, you could have all of those teams at 10-2 or 9-3, and you could have a really tight conference battle, and it could be fascinating to watch throughout the entire thing. And then maybe you have more teams that get in. So it's kind of a complicated thing where I don't really know which path makes for more teams getting in. I do think that a couple of teams totally pulling away from the pack and being 12-1 or 11-2 while everyone else is 8-4 obviously hurts the conference. But there is a reality where a couple of teams pull away, but there still is those 9-3, 10-2 teams that absolutely can litter the playoffs. So in the ACC, it's those teams: Florida State, Clemson, Virginia Tech, Miami, NC State, a ton of other teams. And then in the Big 12, you have Utah, Kansas State, Kansas, Oklahoma State, and a ton more teams that absolutely can get to 9 or 10 wins. And then the issues would arise where the SEC and the Big 10 got into this conversation to have more teams in and to not have to worry about the ACC and the Big 12 stealing some bids. But you do have to make that comparison, right? You do have to say a 9-3 SEC team, what are they to a 10-2 Big 12 team? I would argue they're better, but you don't really know because they haven't necessarily played on a neutral field, and there's an argument to be made from both sides. SEC fans would say, we play in the tougher conference, we play the tougher schedule, we've done a better job of dealing with that schedule and getting to 8-4, getting to 9-3, getting to 10-2 than a team in the Big 12, and that would be a fair argument. Also, if you're a Big 12 or an ACC team, you could say, we played the games in front of us and won as many of them as we possibly could, and we have a better record than them, and that should be what, holds the most water. And I think that would be kind of a fair argument, although I would kind of push back on that a little bit more than the other ones. But the reality is, this is going to be something that has to happen. I think there's going to have to be some type of model put in place that, whether it's the BCS or the S&P Plus or anything in between, just figure out a way to compare these conferences against each other, whether it's how good is an SEC team compared to a Big 12 team or an ACC team, or maybe group of 5 teams absolutely come into this conversation with the ACC and the Big 12. How good is good enough for the group of 5 or for the ACC to compete with some of these bigger teams? And on the flip side, if the SEC or in the Big 10 don't dominate this conversation, what happens on the other side? Because these are the two power brokers in this sport. These are the two people that hold the most power and absolutely will define the future the most in this sport, whether it's snapping up new teams from the ACC or something that absolutely could happen, which is them picking up their ball and taking it elsewhere and playing. The SEC and the Big 10, if you think they haven't thought about breaking off from the NCAA, I have bad news for you, because they absolutely have. These are two conferences that absolutely are looking at all of their options over the next couple of years, and if they don't necessarily get what they want from the playoff, then they might just take their ball and go play elsewhere. And obviously, this doesn't necessarily entail that the playoff should bend their knee to the SEC and the Big 10 and give them as many teams as they want, but it is to say this is the real reality. It's obviously not ideal, but the SEC and the Big 10 didn't sign this deal to get less than, 5, 6, maybe even 7 teams into this thing. They absolutely want to dominate this conversation and be the teams that win the national titles as they have been over the last, decade or so, and be the teams that absolutely dominate this conversation. So it'll be interesting to watch, obviously, whether it's, maybe the ACC and Big 12 have absolute battles and everyone's 10-2 and 9-3, while the SEC has Texas and UGA break away, or the Big Ten has Ohio State and Oregon break away from the pack, and you create kind of a really confusing conversation at the end of the day where you're not just weighing a couple of teams against each other, you're weighing, a whole group of teams against a whole group of another, whether it's 5 against 5 or whatever that looks like. There's going to be a lot of comparison at the end of the year, and there's not a good answer by any means of who's the better team, who's the best or most deserving, or however you want to cut it in the new playoff. There's going to be arguments, and there's going to be a ton of things that we're going to have to kind of digest over this year, whether it's the SEC and the Big Ten possibly being a little bit angry and taking their ball and playing elsewhere, or the ACC and the Big 12 kind of falling into oblivion as the SEC and the Big Ten kind of want them to do in this new playoff, and not being the teams that dominate this conversation by any means. So it'll be fascinating to watch these conferences unfold. Obviously, the ACC and the Big 12 seem to be a little bit more competitive battles. Obviously, the SEC and the Big 10 are going to be incredible, but it does feel like the ACC and the Big 12 are a little bit more crowded, and I think that could create a situation where you have a 9-3 and 10-2 teams just across the board. Also in the SEC, you could have teams pull away. It'll be fascinating to watch these conferences unfold and how it affects the playoff, because it's not just going to have effects in 2024. It's going to have effects across the entirety of the sport over the next couple of years, whether the SEC and the Big Ten get what they want out of this deal. And it'll be fascinating to watch, that's for sure, because it'll have wide-ranging implications around the sport, and we'll likely define it for quite some time. But let's take our third break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about College Football 25. The overall ratings were released for all of the teams, or at least the top 25 teams. I want to break it down because I do have some issues, as I had last week with some of the lists, so we'll break it down right after this, so stick with us.